Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second author reading we're doing here for National Novel Writing Month. My name is Mike. I work here at the Ohio Center for the Book at Cleveland Public Library. Um, Today I'm here with Pete Beatty, who's the author of Cuyahoga, which was long listed for the Penn Hemingway Award in 2020. I'm very excited to have you here. Hello, Pete.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let's start a little bit about how you became a writer. So when did you start writing?
Um, Geez, I did not. I wrote stuff in high school and college. That was just sort of typical, younger, sillier stuff or whatever. But didn't really ever try very hard to take it past that. And then probably a familiar story for a lot of people. That I had to get a job and was like, well, I'm not gonna do this because it just frustrates me and makes me feel like I can't express myself, and it doesn't pay any money, so I'm not gonna do it. Because why would I ever do something like that? So I didn't write for probably 10 years, and then I started to feel like a itch coming on when I was probably about age 30, in part because I was bored of having jobs for, the better part of a decade, and one day on the G train in Brooklyn, um I was coming back from somebody's house on a Sunday morning or something, and I just said, "I am gonna find a way to scam getting paid money to try writing fiction, and maybe I can, if it totally fails, I'll get a job as a teacher or something." Um, and that's what I did. I started applying to MFAs, and I got into an MFA program at the University of Alabama, and I spent 4 years there working on this book, um, Cuyahoga, and that's how it happened.
All right, and this was a question that I had for later. So you started with Cuyahoga?
I have published two pieces of fiction in my life. Uh, one of them is a short story that was actually in Cleveland Scene about leaf blowers. I hate leaf blowers. Um, and the other one is this. I've got stuff in drawers that and stuff I'm working on, but I sort of just let stuff go when I'm good and ready, which is not very often.
Okay, and was that in the scene fiction issue from a couple
Sure.
years back?
Yeah.
Alyssa Nutting, right? Was
Yeah.
in that. Oh wow, I forgot about that. They did it once, I think, and then never did it again.
Yeah. It was nobody reads short fiction.
Yeah.
So it probably wasn't the most popular issue in terms of views or attention or whatever. But it was fun. It was cool to. It was. I was proud to make my published fiction debut in the august Cleveland scene.
And then, so you mentioned that you actually started applying to MFAs, got into Alabama. So those were the MFA was sort of closely associated with having a career as a writer. Or was that a matter of having time to write?
It was pretty much about expediency. I didn't really know um, what I was doing. I just knew that some MFAs were funded, not very well, but funded, where I would have health insurance and enough money to like eat, and enough time to just work. Um, and it delivered on that. It was also a great community. It's how I met my wife. It's like so it worked out in a lot of ways. But yeah, I didn't really. I just wanted time, and I got a lot more than that from Alabama. It was great, and I think it's MFAs are sort of a mixed bag. They are what you make of it, but they also can be kind of goofy in some ways. I can only speak to my experience where I went to a program with a bunch of talented writers who were writing awesome stuff, and I'm still kind of proud to know them. But then there would also be these workshop days where just like I don't want to read or comment on any of it because I don't have anything. I don't have a whole lot to offer.
And so, just interestingly enough, did you work with Michael Martone?
Yeah, he was my thesis advisor
Yeah.
and neighbor in Tuscaloosa.
And, one of the questions I always like to write about writers who or ask of writers who write about Cleveland, did you have any hesitancy writing about Cleveland, or was this always sort of an intention of yours?
Um, I think it was just sort of something I had to get out of my system in a lot of ways, where like I can remember, and Clevelanders of a certain age. I was born in 1981. Can remember sort of catching like Cleveland jokes where like there would just be in like an episode of Saved by the Bell, there'd be a joke about how terrible the Indians slash Guardians are, or you know, just sort of yuck jokes about how Cleveland was terrible or whatever. So you sort of grow up with a chip on your shoulder about the place where you live, and you kind of want to get out of there, and you sort of tend to externalize some of the minor personal tragedies of like being a hormone racked teenager. Like you kind of blame them on Cleveland, which I definitely did. And then I left and I realized like, oh, actually Cleveland's really interesting. It's a really interesting place with that sort of like grew up too fast and then has been in this sort of economic slide for 100 years, like literally since the Great Depression. It really hasn't recovered the economic base that it really didn't have that long to begin with. And meanwhile, all these other things are happening. It's changing. It's going from you know Yankee immigrants to Eastern European and Jewish and Italian, and then African Americans coming up from the South, and all these different things. And so it's a place that's sort of like like everywhere, constantly sort of rewriting its own history. Um, and I just also thought it was. I like history, so I thought that this story of the Bridge War, when the two opposite sides of the Cuyahoga literally got into a shooting conflict over where to locate a bridge, was curious. Yeah, it was something I wanted to do, but it also I wanted to avoid kind of the like I guess the sort of like Rust Belt romantic of like Cleveland used to be big, now it's less big, and some of the stuff is like dusty and rusty. That's sad. I didn't want to sort of be in that heartland rock mode. I think I avoided it completely. Not saying I avoided it by going someplace great, but tried to do it just a different thing.
And that's one of the things that I really appreciated about, Cuyahoga is it really subverts the expectations of all these Rust books, that I can think of. There's no Burning River, for example.
Well, there
There's
is
so many
actually
well, there
there's
is, but
an exploding river, but it's sort of a joke.
right, but there's no yeah, Cuyahoga is burning, vibe to it, which I really appreciate. And as I was reading this, I was thinking about Michael Martone and what he does to Indiana, right, in all his books for sure. Um,
Yeah, and Fort Wayne is seventh on Hitler's list. Was a book that I read. As soon as I knew I was going to go to Alabama, I started reading Martone's writing, and I read that book, and I was like, "This is the kind of thing I want to do." To sort of recuperate some weird history, but also defamiliarize a place a little bit and take it away from sort of unburden it of its shell of just the cliches and shorthand and sort of labels that we attach to a place over time.
and then, do you anticipate, like, sort of mining this further? Like Michael Martone has, he keeps doing it. He keeps doing it in new and refreshing ways. It's really great.
I Michael has he has several superpowers. In addition to being very, very smart and very, very talented and very, very nice, he also has this like boundless ability to find sort of new, interesting things to say about Indiana. I'll probably come back to Ohio as a topic someday, but right now I'm the next thing is set in Alabama.
Alright,
If
very good.
I
No
ever
prob
if I ever actually finish writing it.
and what is the next project?
It's sort of a doofus cop story, sort of in the vein of or somewhere between like Elmore Leonard and Charles Portis with a little bit of uh, action movie type stuff. My initial impulse in it, I sort of on a dare with a friend of mine. I was like, let's just try to write schlocky genre novels in a couple months, and then of course my brain sort of took it in a different direction, and started making it a little bit more complicated. But it's yeah, it's very it's early days with that one, but I'm enjoying working on it.
There's been like a huge resurgence in like the influence of Charles Portis, especially.
Mm.
I think I even sort of hear that voice. I always call it like the literary yokel kind of narrative. Like even a book like Stephen Flora that kind of has that to it as well.
I think of it
Um,
as strip mall fatalism is my like
mm,
working vibe for Charles Portis, but ultimately it's like his I think his line about it was like everything I do just sort of turns into a farce. Like I'm not
mhm,
trying to do it, it just happens.
right. All right. So what is your writing process? What was your writing process for Cuyahoga? Obviously you were in the MFA program, so maybe it's a little bit different than what it would be now.
I very little of it was generated for like turn-ins. Um I was not um the best student as far as the MFA program. And one of the nice things about the University of Alabama MFA is that I was granted the permission to sort of do whatever I wanted, um, as long as I was not a jerk about it. And so what I would do is clock in at 8:30 in the morning and just write until I had to do something. Most days that wasn't until afternoon. And the most important like ingredient in that writing process is I will distract myself if there is a way to do it. So I have a computer that I removed the Wi-Fi card from surgically, and I was at that point, I was not married and I did not have children, so I could just leave my phone in my apartment and go write. Now that I am married and do have children, I have to bring my burner phone, so which only my wife and the daycare have the numbers for, so I can be contacted on. It's just like like a dumb phone, no internet, no email, no anything. Um, and I used Scrivener, the word processing program Scrivener, which is really important for being able to drag around the different sort of pieces of the book and sort of find the order for them.
And now with a wife and kids, so how has that changed?
I write less is the probably the my, Jesmyn Ward, who I think is one of the best writers working in the world period right now. She's cranked out, um, you know, a handful of kind of, you know, world like meaningful contributions to world literature novels, all while, raising children. Um, and sometimes I tell myself like, I got to get tough and just, you just make the time, you just do it. I got to be, up at 4, but other days I don't do that. So it's a balance, it's a balancing act. But ultimately, I think I would say right now that showing up is the most important thing. Like if you just like get there and put your butt in a chair and like try to do something, the work will take you someplace, as Sister Karita Kent taught her art students. So it may not be the best place, and it might be a place that you only came to get directions away from, like Principal Skinner at the brothel, but you'll go someplace.
And then, one last question about the process. I'm curious, having worked on Cuyahoga for so long, and in that voice for so long, when you moved on to a different project, did you struggle to sort of break that voice?
Yeah, it's been a real I think I'm still sort of power washing the narrative, the voice of the narrator of Cuyahoga out of my brain. It's reached the point now where, 3 years after it came out and, not really sometimes I just don't think about it or look at it all that often. So that when I pick it up and his quirks and his idiosyncrasies are actually like, wow, this guy's very mannered, and I have some thoughts for the person who wrote this. So I think it's finally gone now, but I just sort of missed it because he lived in my head. I really had a hard time not thinking in his voice for a while.
Did you ever speak to people in that voice? Did it ever slip out?
Yeah. No, I never spoke out loud, but I definitely, like, thought and sort of, like, wrote things that weren't Cuyahoga, like a to-do list or, grocery list or notes for teaching or whatever. I would write it in the sort of gnarled syntax and elocution of medium son, which was always kind of fun.
All right, awesome. Do you want to read a little bit for us?
Sure. So I always like to give a little bit of setup because it's a book with some moving parts. So I like to just tell you about what's about to happen. So you're about to meet the narrator of this book, who is named Medium Son. Um, he has a brother named Big Son, who you'll hear more about in due course. In the stories you are used to, a stranger arrives at the castle, or the king is gnawed by crisis. Swords bang together, and ghosts trouble a pale hero. Lovers' hearts boiling, and we drink down such wild stories to drown our worries. They're whiskey to wash out our brains. My brother's stories are more apple cider. They're good to drink, but you will not forget yourself entirely. Wholesome tales without too many fricasseed widows. And true mostly. I will not lie any more than is wanted for decency. Simple and moral, easy to grab, the better to encourage someone over the head with. Not too quiet, you must not fall asleep. Let us have commerce and racing horses and progress and the mastery of nature. Swap swords for axes and plows, and let us have tenderness, but also a dash of cussedness and tragedy, and all in the manner native to Ohio. In this story, lovers' hearts do not boil, but go slowly like stew. Crisis has got square cow's teeth instead of fangs. And there is not a king to be seen, only my brother as hero. But we will have a stranger at the castle. I will take that good part. My name is Medium Son. We're no longer strangers any. Folks call me Mead. Exactly what kind of story Mead is going to tell us is a matter of some dispute. It's something that I even disputed as I was writing and switched it up as I was going. But initially, it begins as a tall tale, right? Except, true, but made up, about Big and his heroics. So think, Davy Crockett, Paul Bunyan, Daniel Boone type person. My brother were democratic in his feats. He done them in 100 different patterns, like calico. Big, he is mostly called Big, wrestled bears and every other creature 10 at a time, drank a barrel of whiskey and belched fire. He hung church bells one-handed, hunted 100 rabbits in a day, ate 1,000 pancakes and asked for seconds, drained swamps and cut roads, etc. More feats than I've got numbers to count up. I thrilled most at his brawling with the world itself, at his domesticating Lake Erie and several rivers besides, at his strength turned against soil and stone. There's nothing like the making of a place, to bust up creation, to write your name in the very earth. My brother was a professor of such work. You've heard of Daniel Boone and Colonel Crockett and Mike Fink and other American Herculeses. My brother showed the same appetites. Now, you ask, why is this big son not the hero of every child? What feats of his do I know? Well, the reason why you haven't heard of Big Son is something that slowly unfolds over the course of the book, right? But he really does have a sort of specific appetite for taking on the natural world and sort of pummeling it into compliance with the American project, right? With making a place and making that place profitable, right? He fights Lake Erie to get it to stop misbehaving. He clears these dense woods to make space for Ohio City. on the west side of the Cuyahoga to grow. Mhm. His feat's gone on in this general way for years. My brother proved himself a foremost spirit of the times. Now, you're familiar with how a spirit of the times done. Tamed bears, wrestled the Pope of Rome, romanced queens and milkmaids, half horse, half alligator, and another half Wolverine set on top, etc. In truth, Big did not meet the Pope any, never seen any queens. It's only a matter of talking. Pope or no, my brother were red pepper at a Sunday supper. You know how red pepper tastes, loud and foolish. My brother has quieter flavors to him as well, tenderness, cussedness, and tragedy, as I promised. I will put these down directly. Big, or Mead, I should say, is very bad at actually telling a story in a straightforward manner, so he does not put them down directly. But what he does tell you is about Big's kind of glitch, right? Which is that he is more loved and adored than paid. Okay. In the Gospels, Jesus talks about how a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown. And Big is kind of a variation on that theme. He is a superhero, a spirit of the times, right? He's not without honor except in his hometown. At first, Big did not mind his empty palms. Not when he whipped a lake, not when he lied to the devil, stalked the deepest woods, hog-tied panthers, drained jugs, got stung by 1,000 hornets and only smiled, cut roads, moved the mouth of Cuyahoga, dug a canal, drained 20 swamps, rescued 100 widows, and several married men besides. He's got more feats than you have ears to hear, and he never asked a penny for them. Besides, what do you and your ears have to pay for such a thing? What is the correct price of such merchandise? And so Big came to live on adoration, by slaps on his back, by refreshment, by the flock of small fry that imitated him, by other folks' wonder. And this arrangement were considered settled in ink by the citizens of Ohio City and Cleveland. The tenderness, cussedness, and tragedy came in when Big decided it was not enough to be wondered at. What that means, practically speaking, is that he wants money so he can set himself up as a merchant or a farmer or something respectable and make himself a honest husband for the woman he loves, Chloe Inches, who also happens to be his orphan sister, which is to say they're not related, but they grew up in the same house. So reasonable plan, not unreminiscent of Pinocchio hoping to become a real boy. There is a problem with this plan, which is that Chloe does not actually want to marry him. More on that later. And you know the advertisement by now. Big Son has wrestled rivers and lakes and rescued women in woe, met the devil twice and whipped him 3 times, ate panther fricassee for breakfast and tiger steaks at supper, taught wolves how to wail, put a face on the moon with a rusty musket. Big Son has done more feats than you have brains to hold, etc. For his next one, he liked something else entirely. No brawling, no biting, no empty palms. For his next wonder, Big wished to grab hold of the land as he had watched men do, to make a place of his own and populate it with shining haired small fry, to quit being wondered at and start wondering on, to quit being loved up and start loving. He wanted to be more flesh than spirit. He wanted Miss Chloe. Big isn't the only spirit in town. There are other spirits, good and bad, in this version of northeastern Ohio, right? The Ohio country has got spirits like the wood has panthers, more heard of than seen. But there was Courthouse Shad of Painesville who put law on the blizzards and bargained them into a treaty. They could snow the town to the waist 4 months a year as long as they behaved the rest. In Conneaut, it was Finland Pete who dug a harbor with one belch. In Newburgh, you had Wagon Face, a fascination whose face were wider than it were tall. He had ears as round as wheels. I can't remember what feats Wagon Face done, but I know he were responsible somehow for the watermill down that way. In Worcester, you had Dorothy Fangs, who could outwork a dozen menfolk to dying and bury them without mussing her apron. These spirits were more heard of than seen, but when you did see them, you recollected it all your life. I do not say these were all true spirits, but neither does that make them false. You never saw Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett or Fink or Billy Earthquake Esquire either, and they are in newspapers and almanacs. There's spirits will go sideways on you too. You got to keep an eye on them, right? Because there are some bad spirits too, right? Like Big sort of wonders whether he's going to turn into another Johnny Appleseed, another Johnny Chapman, right? And Mead remembers a time that Johnny Appleseed came through Ohio City when he and Big were boys. He dressed in such rags that you could see through to his privates. His beard were all matted up into felt. Even his gifts of apple seed seemed untoward. He wore a chamber pot on his head, and I doubt he remembered the last time he went to bed sober. Chapman visited us long ago, before any of Big's feats, before the incident that put the spirit into Big, before the West Side had more than a few folks. Big and I were small, on account of Chapman's reputation as patron of the orchards. The settlement of Cleveland put on a celebratory feed. Chapman didn't eat a bite, only drank awful amounts. His very presence put an itch on you, like you were dressed in winter clothes at summer. The more we seen of Chapman, the more we wanted shut of him. After he got too hospitable towards the young maid, some of the men encouraged him to move along. His scent stayed on for some days. And Chapman showed that a spirit of the times is not an incorruptible thing, not hooped with iron, not immune from rust or rodents. There were others like him. In Lorraine, their large Dutch had turned wild like a night pig, hollering in German about no one known what, robbing farmers. Near Hinckley, folks feared to meet Feathers, with his gown made of buzzards. He stole children. Dick of Norwalk lived underwater and ate sailors. There was Stinking Squirrel Coat of the Woods. Chapman and all those proved that spirits did have a tendency to go sideways, although Big were surely not as sideways as Chapman. Chapman had a democratic use in his prime, spreading the hygienic drink of cider. But by the time of my encounter, he was all chewed up. And I'd thought on Big's question that he'd asked that night. What kind of spirit were Big? When is the spirit's work finished? What comes after? Before Mead and Big can figure out the answer to that question, what comes after being a spirit, a tall tale hero? The two brothers and Chloe and everyone else they know get roped into a controversy that's on the verge of blowing Cleveland apart, quite literally. Um, this is actually based in part on real Cleveland history, the Bridge War that happened in the late 1830s when factions in town who owned different mercantile concerns and speculated in real estate in different places really disputed quite hotly where to build a permanent bridge across the Cuyahoga. And their real dispute actually got so intense that bridges were blown up. Um, a lot of words were said in anger. Some blood was shed, although no people died. According to one account, a cow did die. So they were really mad at each other. And Mead is really pondering how it could be that two places so similar that now they're just one place. Cleveland and Ohio City have been one since the 1850s. Could hate each other so much. My consideration, the sour blood between cities were only busted romance. I once saw young John Stiles pull at the pigtails of Katie Basket, and Katie shoved him into a pig hole. The bridge were Cleveland yanking at Ohio City to speed a marriage. But Ohio would never consent to wed until Cleveland sat in a pig hole. Meade gets to thinking about this, and some seeds start to germinate in his brain. Christ says that if a man smites you on one cheek, you ought to show him the other. so that he might smite you better a second time. And if that same fellow come after your coat, you ought to hand it over too, along with your cloak and your breeches and your drawer too. Resist not evil, etc. Regarding smiting of faces and stealing of coats, I seen what Christ meant mostly. If you are always returning such conduct, the whole world will always have a sore face and a naked ass. I did sometimes wonder how matters would go if we all obliged. What becomes of the smiter? Who is this fellow clobbering and stealing shirts? What goads him to the work? Maybe he is a drunk fool. Maybe he's sore hearted. Maybe he only wants someone to talk at and knows no better way than to pull pigtails. Maybe he's only naked and wants a coat. Now, the seed that's being planted here is that medium son is jealous of his brother. And that only intensifies when their foster father, Job, comes up with a scheme for getting big out of the funk that he falls into, which is to put his feet down into an almanac and to have that almanac be sold for money that'll help Big get set up in reality. And Medium Son gets tasked with the writing. There's a reason his name is Medium. He's a medium of sorts, right? He gets tasked with the writing. He realizes that there's something itching at him. He starts to itch all over, like there was wood from whittling gotten into my drawers. I decided then that I knew the origins of my discomfort. I had always lived in the shadow of Big, and I had grown accustomed to the cold. I had made small rebellions, perhaps you guessed that I wrote down the measurements wrong for Big's bridge, I confess it. Now, after a season spent on this almanac, without Big's company but still in his shadow, I were too jealous for such petty revolts. I were absent from my own almanac, from my own life. I had written down 101 stories of my brother and not a single one about myself. I'd make my mark, such that folks would have to remember Mr. Medium Son. Only one feat would do. I would do what my brother could not. I would chase the night pigs out of Ohio. That's the one thing that Big Son is afraid of is the pigs who roam through Cleveland at night, which is actually inspired by a typo on a historical marker in the Monroe Street Cemetery in Ohio City. If you want to know what happens with the pigs, with Big, with me, with Chloe, with all that stuff, with the bridges, you can read the rest of the book. But that's a taste of what Cuyahoga is like and what it's all about.
Great. Thank you for that reading.
Yeah,
Uh, that was great. Uh, let's see. Oh, we have some hands of applause. The digital hands of applause.
thank you.
Very good. So, can you talk a little bit about the melding of research with sort of your embellishments? How did that come about? So, for example, the night pigs. I know when I read that about the Monroe Street Cemetery, I quickly went to the case encyclopedia of Cleveland history, right? And true enough, there are pigs there
Yeah.
that they put up fences. So, can you talk a little bit about that research?
So that particular point was probably a pretty exemplary thing where you had a kind of something that just stuck in my brain. Um, in that case, seeing the historical marker, and there's like the greatest, most poetic typo on this historical marker. It talks about how the community in the neighborhood around Monroe Street, which it's sort of hidden a little bit. It's sort of tucked away south of Lorraine, not too far from St. Ignatius's campus, sort of in this little sort of pocket neighborhood that's cut off by railroad tracks. So I think it's not something that even people who spend a lot of time in Cleveland maybe even know that there's an older cemetery there. Quite nice, quite peaceful. Um, it was so nice that the pigs, the loose pigs that were a pretty common feature of early 19th century cities, would go into the graveyard and rustle around for acorns and things like that. And the people sort of decide we can't be having this. We can't have our loved ones resting in eternity with pigs. Cavorting and doing whatever else pigs do. So they took up a subscription and built a fence to keep out the wandering pigs. But the typo on the sign says wandering pigs. That typo combined with my love of a particular mountain goat song, and which is shares its name with a verse from the synoptic gospels, a story from the synoptic gospels about Christ taking an unclean spirit out of an afflicted person and putting it into a herd of swine. um Got me thinking about, like, I'm gonna make pigs sort of the big bad here. Of course, you find out that, of course, they're just regular pigs. They're totally harmless. Um, and sort of the same thing would happen. There's a recurring gag in the book about this dental, this dentifrice, I guess you would call it, which is creosote. Creosote is coal tar. It's like the only time you might put it on your body nowadays would be as an ingredient in like dandruff shampoo. It's not something you want to directly apply to your gums, because it would eat the tissue. It was something actually that sort of the vaguely medieval dentists of the 1830s did use, um, as a sort of like anti-necrotic thing. I came across an ad for a Dr. Strickland in perusing old copies of the Cleveland Advertiser at the Case Western Historical Society, or the Western Reserve Historical Society. And it was this dude's ad, which I actually reproduced in the book just because it was too cool not to, um, is the most like metal thing. It shows his incorruptible teeth. Like he would fit people with presumably like wood or I don't know, metal um, dentures. And reading about that got me really curious about what was this guy like, and that just sort of became a plot element. It actually leads quite directly to an explosion that kills the main character in the book. No spoilers. Um, the Here's Dr. Strickland in his little ad right there. Um, Thankfully, it's old enough that I didn't have to worry about getting permission to reuse it. I just sort of grabbed it and threw it in there. And I had a really awesome resource, which was the newspaper collections at the Western Reserve Historical Society. My dad was working there at the time, and so he would just sort of like let me in on the weekends and let me poke around. They had a fire over there recently. I think some of the newspapers were. I hope the newspapers weren't lost, but I was sad to
Ju
hear that they're all
just
right.
like a week ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're closed indefinitely.
Good.
Um, so you actually did, like, physical hands-on research. How much of the plot was figured out before you did this research?
Very little.
Mm.
It was very much just sort of um, this kind of building the car while I was driving it thing. Um, it was much more of a. It started as being about big, and it didn't have anything to do with the bridge war. And then I realized that it was just kind of it didn't have like a motor, so I was like, well, what's this guy's problem? What does he need? And I needed something to sort of like to make it move, and that was what wound up sort of speaking to me. And it's something I've been thinking about and thinking about writing nonfiction about. I had written a sort of longer thing for Belt magazine about the Van Swearingen brothers, Cleveland's weird railroad baron brothers. And I think that is probably where, I mean, other than like Cain and Abel, and Jacob and Esau from the Bible, that's probably where the idea of sort of two odd brothers sort of got in the got into my brain.
So with Mead's voice, when did that voice sort of first come to you?
Um, Probably I mean, very early on, I read this novel by a writer named Paul Kingsnorth called The Wake, which is a wonderful and I would say psychotically indulgent is probably a fair description, book that he has written in what it's called he calls it a ghost language, where it sort of has a lot of the sort of grammar and vocabulary of Middle English, and then he's sort of just done the stuff he's added words that he wants to add. It has no punctuation, um, and it's told from the sort of interior monologue of a sort of a man who's been driven insane by grief, who's, like, lost his sons in the Norman invasion and was probably not, super well adjusted before that happened, sort of communing with the old gods and the new gods and stuff like that, and the voice of that novel just blew my really, really, really knocked my socks off, and so it kinda started just as, like, slavish, imitation to see if I could find a sort of, like, mumbly, idiosyncratic kind of frontier voice.
And I like the idea of a ghost language, because, one of the really funny things about Cuyahoga is the sort of, corrupted colloquialisms that sort of appear throughout, my favorite being, I think, "boiled pink," which is really funny, but it sounds it's just really funny. Did you have, like, a list of those types of phrases as you came out, or did they come out during the writing?
Some of them were, just, those happy sort of miracles where you just are successfully create something out of your brain. But most of them were usually you'd come across some of these like I can't get enough of sort of the crazy inventiveness and weirdness that humanity packs into language and how we talk about things and how it's a time machine and all these different things. So to look at I think there's a corny saying about like a newspaper being the sound of a country talking to itself or whatever, but I think it's actually kind of true. So if you look at newspapers, which were pretty short on news in the 1830s, because not that much stuff happened, and so there would be like jokes and recipes, and then a lot of things of people being like, "I lost a cow. Have you seen this cow? I found a dog. Are you missing your dog?" And then just like, "Hey, our store has this stuff for sale." Um, and reading those just absorbing it, to Charles Portis, who I just, really floats my boat and I love. He was, a newspaper reporter for a long time, and one of his earlier jobs was working as a stringer in Arkansas and sort of taking, a stringer as a reporter who sort of just, like, talks to people and gets quotes from them or whatever, and very often isn't even published under their own byline, but just sort of does, like, the scut work of reporting, and a lot of his reporting would be in the country in Arkansas talking to really, really old people, people who sort of had this like archaic, language, and his task was essentially sterilizing it, was taking out all of this amazing color and weirdness and accent and just writing it in, AP style or whatever the news style was. And he talks about in some of his nonfiction writing about how he viewed True Grit, which is another book that was kind of a load star for me in writing Cuyahoga in terms of the voice, as an act of expiation for the sin of erasing all of the interesting language that these people do. It's one of the things I love about living in the South is that occasionally you'll just hear. My wife and I were talking with an older woman at a like an antique store, and she gave us directions to lunch. And she said, "You go over that overpass," but it wasn't. She didn't say overpass. She said overpass. And just like those sounds and imagining them are so much fun. So between looking at old newspapers, old stories, and things like that, and just sort of trying to get a little bit of that old weird America, I view it. I mean, it's just like fun. It's like a kid in a candy store type thing. What's that big candy store on Brook Park Road? It's like just like the place where you go and you spontaneously get diabetes. It's that kind of
BA
feel.
Sweeties, right?
Yeah, BA Sweeties.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about sort of the corpus of language.
Yeah, and some contemporary examples of that, I personally love Studs Terkel, love reading Studs Terkel and going through that, and that sort of influence now with, like, Catherine Scanlon, she's repurposing interviews with people and creating novels out of that.
Yeah,
Um,
what was the horse trainer book?
yeah, Kick the Latch
Yeah,
just
Kick
came
the Latch
out
is one of my
this year.
absolute favorite things I've read in the past couple of years.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yep,
cool.
yep. Um, let's see. So as we reach towards the end here, if anybody has any questions, you can drop them in the chat. We can ask Pete those questions. Um, one word that you mentioned earlier, Pete, was mannered
Mhm.
voice. As chaotic as it seemingly appears, there's always these repetitions that sort of ground the voice. Um, in the mannered way where it's not totally chaotic. Everything's on purpose. Can you talk about the revision process of writing a voice like that, where you have to kind of go back and make sure that Mead's sort of following his own grammatical rules?
Copy editing this, the person who copy edited Cuyahoga is a living saint because, you know, she went through kind of on a more or less cold read and said, caught all these tiny little things of, like here he says this, but here he does this like one slightly different thing and caught all of this stuff. And I sort of had to plea for there's some intentional deviations that are sort of like load bearing from his particular way of talking and thinking. And it's kind of like I've never written comedy or things like that, but I get it's sort of like one of these things where you just like you do different passes just to go over the surface of the text and look for places where you can stick in these little markers that sort of create little callbacks or echoes. And so once this is actually something that I probably the place where it maybe stuck in my head is a Chekhov short story. I can't even remember which one, but there's one where he literally turns like a lamp, an oil burning lamp into it just like is this like perfect little hinge point in the story where it flips back later and it sparks a lot of it structurally it's not complicated or anything. It's just like when you get enough of those together, you start to get kind of these it's like it starts to sound like shoegaze music where there's just like feedback on feedback on feedback on feedback. And I really enjoy that as long as you can still kind of hear the notes underneath.
I think George Saunders, writing about Donald Barthelme, mentioned that Barthelme had the ability to sort of front load everything to the point where everything thereafter was loaded with meaning, whether it was on purpose or not, right? All right, so we have a question here from Joseph. How has your MFA informed, shaped, enhanced your fiction writing? And were there any things that you had to unlearn from your
That's a
MFA program?
that's a good question. I had my just particular arc through life. Rest in peace, Christopher from The Sopranos. Was such that I was already like most as grown up as I'm gonna get when I did my MFA, which I think was useful. Um, I did not have like supreme artistic confidence or anything like that, but I kind of just wanted to put my head down and plow forward on it. The MFA definitely there's a certain kind of just like what's the word I'm thinking of? Like entropy or sort of like happy accidents that happen where, I took a class where we read the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. And one of the other students in that class wrote these incredible sort of lyric poems about sort of contemporary people whose lives were sort of like sketched out in the sort of style of Achilles. The way that the story of the rage of Achilles is told in the Odyssey, in that inspired me in thinking about it, saying, "Well, I can get a little bit of that in this thing that I'm working on." I could start to bring in there's some epithets that get applied to people in the book, like Big Son has shining hair, much like, Hector has a shining helmet in the Iliad, things like that. There were dozens of happy little collisions like that, which I loved. Where and there's also this element of community. I mean, I think anybody talking about college, they'll say, I'm not sure that I always got everything I was supposed to out of the class, but meeting people and finding my people and doing things and kind of just being, in the words of Larry McMurtry in Lonesome Dove, being a human being loose on the surface of the world, um, mattered a lot. And I had to be there. And even though that wasn't what my tuition was for, that like it mattered. It worked. So the MFA did a lot of that. And this is probably not a shock. I was the only person writing a like heavily dialect 1830s superhero novel in my fiction classes. So it was a great place to get smart responses from people who otherwise would never have um, seen my writing. I hope I did half as well as some of the feedback I got from other students, and of course the professors are all very 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 sharp and smart and compassionate too. Ultimately, most important, I'd say, I don't know if that it really changed my writing, other than just giving it time to exist, but it did instill the idea of the no is not a word that can gets you very far in trying in a sort of like large scale act of personal expression. Because if you're finding reasons not to do something, not to try a certain approach or whatever, you're gonna sort of get failure to launch a little bit. I think personally, you just sort of have to have this. Even if the writing style itself is not maximalist, you kind of have to have this like Walt Whitman feeling of just like tear your shirt, let your river flow, as the band sings in Jemima Surrender. Um, in terms of unlearning some things, I will say right now in the writing process that I've been writing with, sort of ebbs and, false starts and hot streaks and stuff for the past few years towards a few different large projects. And one thing is, I think the MFA program kind of got me thinking that everything has to be deep or about something, and sometimes you just need to like have the scene where somebody eats breakfast, and like you want to make it good and rich and satisfying, but also just like you gotta sort of like tell a story too. And I think maybe that particular mode of fiction is not it's just not like it's not particularly trendy right now, unless it's auto fiction and it's you describing the contours of your butthurt feelings or whatever. No, I like a lot of autofiction, but when it's at its worst, on a bad day, it can be kind of a drag.
So I like that idea of, sometimes writing about dinner, something simple like that, just having it exist on the page, and maybe in some ways that's coming back with sort of these high modernist replica books that are coming out,
And it's also, it's something that I teach actually my like freshman comp students is like, I like this movie. It's not a thesis, but if you say I like this movie because of the way, blah 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 blah, insert thing that you noticed, all of a sudden you're cooking with gas and you just have to go back and cut out the boring part. um Elmore Leonard, I think, gets the late Elmore Leonard gets a lot, is sort of, every once in a while he used to become like this sort of like stock figure for writers in the internet to dunk on because of his rules of like leave out the boring parts, don't use dialogue tags. Um, First of all, they're just recommendations. They're just like how Elmore Leonard wrote. They're not rules. I think he literally says at the end, like, "Don't follow these rules too closely." Um, I'm always shocked at how stupid writers are, including myself. It's like if you're using the hashtag "am writing," you're not writing. You're on Twitter. The Says the guy who's not looked at Twitter in 9 years. That sort of like even if like you get someplace and like you're asking that question of like, how did the sort of like repetitions and sort of reiterations of ticks in the voice, how did they happen? Is writing way more than ever made it into the book. I probably deleted twice as much text as there is actual text in between the covers. A lot of it is terrible, like really like cringe, true cringe, and it got deleted for a reason. But those reps, those movements, like surfaced things, and then they could be like exported and put someplace where they could work. So every once in a while, you just sort of mow the lawn for 20 hours, and eventually you'd hit a rock, and then you'd have a rock, and like you get a little pile of rocks going.
And I'm not really one to criticize MFAs, but there is the tendency where you're not allowed to take those detours and everything, so that has to be focused on making the book, right? Everything you write has to sort of
Yeah.
work towards the
And I
book.
think that has less to do with like the individual artists
Mhm.
and the MFA program, just down to like the performative side of it, right? Where you want to be good and you want to be showing people that you're good and you want to be, it's hard to share bad writing. It feels you real there's an element of trust that you're not necessarily going to have with people who you don't know very well. It's hard to share bad writing. I have a lot of bad writing I've never showed anybody. Um, so that might be, that could be maybe a more charitable way of putting it. I can be a little cantankerous and prone to exaggeration, but yeah, it does kind of it just the scenario sort of does pressurize um writing a little bit to try to make it kind of show stopping or big.
The names in the book, I'm really
Mhm.
curious about, some of which I'm assuming are true, real names,
Mhm.
and then some of which are completely fabricated, right?
Yeah. So um Chloe Inches is a real person who actually existed in a slightly earlier era, probably like 20, like when Cleveland was truly like the frontier, like the sort of bleeding edge of sort of European settlement. Um, I changed the spelling of her name. I took away the H from Chloe just to distinguish her. Um, she actually comes up as a character in a sort of fairly obscure book of short stories by or sort of linked pieces by Scott Sanderson called Wilderness Plots, which I thought was really good. I liked it a lot. Job Styles, real person. I think Job Styles married Chloe Inches, whereas in Cuyahoga they have a different relationship. I just thought it was a great name. It looks like Job Styles on the page. There was a person named Big Son. He was actually a Native American. He was not white. But um, in I think like the Charles Whittlesley 1890 something history of Cleveland, it actually has that's where I got the specific inspiration to have different running headers on the tops of the pages of the book, where every page sort of has some unique phrase that's kind of describing or referring to what's happening here. And Big Son's name appeared in one of those and just caught my eyes. Like that is the most right there, obvious, great names, sort of like it's a little bit of a Christ figure, but just like Big Son. And then Medium Son kind of initially there were going to be three of them. There was also a Small Son. Small son got cut out because he didn't really have a whole lot to do. Um, that came from a guy in Toledo around the time of the Toledo War, who named his children 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I thought it'd just be funny to literally just say like big to name them all the same, name them all son, and just distinguish them by size. Dogstatter, I think it's just like a name. I think there was like a Nicholas Dogstatter who was mayor of Cleveland. And some of them are just made up. The one that I'm most proud of is Abyssalith, which was just me moving the L and the B in Elizabeth to make a weird new name.
And I like how the logic sort of presents itself to you throughout the course of writing. It's really great. Last question is, do you have any book recommendations for us that you might consider us checking out? You mentioned a lot of Charles Portis. I'm sure Dog of the South is a big one too for you.
I listened to Dog of the South in the car on audiobook to get in my fake rustic mode.
Mm.
Um just this morning. Kick the Latch by Catherine Scanlon, one of my favorite things I read last year. A Month in the Country by a British guy named J.L. Carr. It's fantastic. It's older. I think it's probably from the 70s or 80s. It's the story of a World War One vet who's dealing with shell shock, or what we would call PTSD, and also having been ditched by his wife. And he gets hired on to restore a medieval fresco in a church. And that's pretty much all that happens in the book. But it's this like beautiful, patient, funny, quirky portrait of oddballs, sort of bouncing off one another. And it's short too. God, I love short books. The The Summer Book by Tove Jansson, who's better known as the creator of the Moomins, wonderful children's literature. That's another book where kind of not a lot happens. Um, and just because I can, I'm gonna throw one out there for people. More people should read D.A. Levy, the Cleveland's great poetic weirdo. I was just looking for and not finding my my copy of his collected works, which has some really just like, it's of its time, and I think it has some preoccupations that maybe haven't aged perfectly, but man, when it's good, it's so good. It is so good. Um, I think what one other great book that I read this year. This is amazing, but I waited until I was 42 years old to read Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, and it's unbelievable. I almost sweared. Can't swear at the library, but like everyone, literally, that book should be the national anthem. You should just every time at the beginning of every sports event, you should have to read the entire book. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston.
Awesome recommendations. DA Levy is like if you decide you want to be a writer right about when you're a teenager, you start getting into like Kerouac or some of those folks, and then you're like, oh well, there was this dude in Cleveland too, right?
Yeah.
The censorship trial. I think CSU has a really good collection, everything from
Mm,
him.
yeah,
Uh,
all his papers, and he did. I
yeah.
mean, he was an artist too, in addition
Hmm.
to his writing art. I like the theory that he was assassinated,
Uh,
um, rather than committed suicide. I'm a truther for DA Levy murdered by the feds. You
mhm.
heard it here first. Like, don't shut us down. You can't cut the Zoom off. NSA, I know you're watching. You got blood in your hands.
All right. Well, I think that'll be it. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Pete, for joining us today. Great book recommendations, great reading, great answers. And thanks to everybody who showed up today.
Thanks.
And and if you're participating in National Novel Writing Month, I hope you're having a good time. Pete, have you ever done anything like that?
I think I lasted like 3 days.
3 days?
But you know what? I'm feeling inspired. I'm gonna show up. I'm gonna clock in tomorrow morning and write. And I'm gonna let the fact that it's terrible not be an issue. Just gonna just go for it.
And I think you've got about 3 or 4 days, where you can take off, and then you'd still be able to produce a good short book, I think, right?
Right